The gavel cracked against the wood with a force that echoed off the marble walls. Judge Beryl Howell's voice followed, sharp and commanding, as she declared her intent to sanction Representative Jasmine Crockett. For a heartbeat, the courtroom seemed to forget how to breathe. Gasps rippled through the benches. Journalists shifted in their seats, pens hovering above notepads. Cameras clicked in rapid bursts, each flash capturing a moment of history unfolding. The charge hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. Sanction rare, severe. A punishment reserved for those the court wanted silenced, shamed, or broken. And yet at the center of this storm sat Jasmine Crockett, unmoving her expression, carved in calm defiance. Her hands folded neatly on the table before her, she looked not at the judge, but straight ahead, as if she could already see beyond the walls pressing in around her. Every eye was locked on the young congresswoman. Some expected a trembling apology, a retreat, the kind of submission power demands. Others braced for a fiery outburst, a clash of raised voices and shattered decorum. But Crockett gave them nothing. She sat motionless, her stillness louder than any protest. The whispers began. "Did she hear what Howell just said?" one man hissed. "She's finished," muttered another, shaking his head. A woman in the gallery clutched her phone, texting furiously as if racing to break the news before anyone else. The energy in the room shifted from shock to anticipation. Something was coming. Everyone knew it. Judge Howell adjusted her robe, confident, even smug, as though her word alone could rewrite destiny. But under the heavy silence, there was a humming, unspoken tension that suggested the story was not yet hers to tell. Crockett's composure was not resignation, it was preparation. The longer she sat without reaction, the more the balance of power seemed to tilt. The judge had the gavel, but Crockett had something harder to define: presence, resolve. The quiet dignity of someone who had faced storms far greater than this. Her critics leaned forward, waiting for the crack in her armor, waiting for the crumble. Instead, they saw steel. The courtroom froze. Cameras clicked. Every eye was locked on the young congresswoman. And then but what Crockett did next left. Even her harshest critics speechless. Sanctions are not routine courtroom tools. They are weapons of last resort, punishments wielded to silence those who, in the eyes of authority, have stepped too far out of line. When a judge invokes sanctions, it carries the weight of humiliation, financial penalty, and professional scar. For most lawyers, the very mention is enough to trigger fear, to pull them back into obedience. That was the tradition, the precedent, the intended effect. Which is why this moment Judge Beryl Howell, calling for a sanction against Jasmine Crockett, crackled. With a charge far beyond the wood and marble confines of the courtroom, this was not just a procedural rebuke. It was political theater, cloaked in judicial robes. Howell's gavel carried the full symbolism of institutional authority, centuries of precedent and power flowing through her voice. She stood not just as a judge, but as the embodiment of a system that too often punishes the defiant and rewards the compliant. In that instant, Howell sought to remind Crockett, and everyone watching, exactly who was supposed to be in control. And yet Crockett was not the usual target. She was no anonymous attorney, quietly cowed by the threat of professional ruin. Was a congresswoman, a woman of color, a truth-teller, who had built her career on refusing to bow to intimidation. To sanction her was not only rare, it was explosive, signaled an attempt to discipline not just one woman, but the spirit she represented, voices from the margins rising to demand accountability. The audience understood this instinctively. Every reporter in the gallery could feel the stakes. Every whisper carried the same unspoken thought. If Howell succeeds here, what message does that send? This was not about one sanction. It was about whether the system could bend someone like Jasmine Crockett into silence. And so, as the gavel's echo faded, the courtroom became more than a legal chamber. It became a stage upon which questions of race, gender, and power played out. Howell, cloaked in her authority, represented the old guard, the presumption that control belongs to those who sit highest on the bench. Crockett, seated quietly yet defiantly, embodied the new guard, the belief that dignity and truth can outlast even the sharpest strike from power. It was not lost on anyone that Crockett's very presence challenged the hierarchy. A black woman in a position of national influence, standing toe-to-toe with a federal judge, refusing to shrink. The optics alone made the moment combustible. If Howell thought she could sanction her into submission, the opposite effect was already beginning to stir. The silence was not fear, it was suspense. Across the country, phones buzzed with breaking alerts. Clips from the courtroom filtered onto social media, half-captured headlines promising confrontation. Hashtags began to form even before the dust settled. Everyone sensed this was more than a ruling. It was a moment that could change the course of political accountability. To some, it was a test of whether authority could still silence the bold. To others, it was the spark of something bigger. In Howell's eyes, this was supposed to be control. But to the people watching, it looked like desperation. Judges rarely pull the sanction card unless they feel challenged. And Howell's decision to wield it against Crockett suggested just that. She was rattled. The judge thought this would intimidate her. Instead, it lit a fire that would soon ignite the room. Beryl Howell had built her career on authority. For years, she had carried the reputation of a stern judge who demanded respect and enforced it with an iron grip. Colleagues described her as disciplined, meticulous, unflinching in the face of controversy. But critics painted a different portrait of a woman who relished the weight of her gavel a little too much, who used the bench not only to administer justice, but to reinforce the hierarchy she so clearly embodied. Her rulings had stirred fierce debate before. To some, she was a defender of institutional integrity, unafraid to hand down harsh measures when she believed they were deserved. To others, she was a symbol of judicial overreach, too willing to flex her power in ways that seemed politically tinged. The whispers were always the same. Howell didn't just interpret the law, she shaped it to remind everyone who was in charge. Moments from her past rulings lingered in the public consciousness. Attorneys recalled how she cut them off mid-sentence, her voice dripping with disdain, as if their words had wasted her time. Activists remembered cases where her decisions seemed less about the merits than about preserving the court's image of authority. Too many watching from the sidelines, Howell's courtroom was not just a space for justice, but a stage where she performed power. That image, cloaked in the black robe of impartiality, gave her strength. It allowed her to stride into any proceeding with the assumption that her word would not be questioned, that her rulings would stand because they came from the bench. It was an aura of invincibility, one cultivated carefully, one rarely tested. And it was exactly that aura that made her move against Jasmine Crockett feel so loaded, so dangerous, because Crockett was not like the others. She was not an anonymous lawyer, easily cowed by the prospect of sanctions and professional disgrace. She was a congresswoman with a national platform, a woman of color with a history of refusing to be silenced, someone who understood that her voice carried far beyond the courtroom walls. In attempting to sanction Crockett, Howell had miscalculated. What might have worked on lesser-known figures was now colliding with a public servant who thrived in the spotlight. Still, Howell pressed forward, her expression cold, confident. To her, the courtroom was her domain. Crockett might have carried titles and influence outside, but in here, Howell was sovereign. This was her kingdom, and the gavel was her crown. The sanction was more than a punishment. It was a declaration: you may have power in Congress, but in this room, control your fate. But arrogance has a way of clouding judgment. Howell underestimated how the optics of this battle would look. A federal judge cloaked in authority wielding her power against a young black congresswoman. It was a tableau that carried echoes of history, the very imagery of systems punishing those who dared to challenge them. What Howell thought was strength appeared to many watching as insecurity. What she intended as discipline looked, under the spotlight, like fear. Her critics seized on this pattern. They pointed to her past with renewed scrutiny, noting how often her harshest rulings seemed to fall hardest on those who challenged institutional narratives. Howell's defenders claimed she was simply following the law. But in the gallery, in the press, and soon across social media, another story was taking shape. Howell was rattled. She was wielding the sanction not as a tool of justice, but as a weapon of intimidation, and Crockett's silence. In that moment, her refusal to flinch only magnified the contrast. The more Howell projected her authority, the more it seemed to slip through her fingers. The robe gave her the illusion of invulnerability, but illusions can shatter quickly when confronted with truth. To Howell, the sanction was supposed to be the end of the story. To the public, it was only the beginning. The battle lines were drawn. Not between two legal arguments, between two visions of power, one rooted in fear and control, the other in dignity and defiance. Howell believed her robe made her untouchable. She was about to learn how wrong she was. Jasmine Crockett's story was never one of easy paths or inherited privilege. Born into a working-class family in Texas, she grew up in a world that did not hand out favors. A world where her very existence as a young black girl meant she had to fight twice as hard for half the recognition. The lessons of resilience were not taught in classrooms. They were carved into her life by necessity. From the very beginning, she learned how to turn struggle into strength. Her childhood was filled with reminders of the odds stacked against her. Teachers who doubted her potential, peers who underestimated her drive, institutions that were never built for her success. But where others might have bent under that pressure, Crockett discovered something different within herself. A refusal to accept the roles society assigned. She learned to meet doubt with determination, to meet dismissal with persistence. It was in school debates and community meetings where her sharp wit first took shape. She had a gift for cutting through noise with words that landed like precision strikes. Friends recall her challenging authority figures not out of rebellion for its own sake, but because she had a deep sense of fairness. If something was wrong, she could not stay silent. That instinct to speak truth, even when it came at personal cost, became her defining trait. Her path to law school was not lined with silver spoons, but with grit and sacrifice. She took jobs to pay bills, fought her way through classes, and faced down professors who underestimated her resolve. The courtroom became her battlefield, and soon her reputation grew as a defender of the voiceless. She took cases others avoided, those involving police misconduct, those mired in racial injustice, because she knew what it meant for people to feel invisible. And yet, even as she built her career, she faced constant attacks. Critics questioned her qualifications, dismissed her confidence as arrogance, and labeled her passion as anger. But every insult became fuel. Where some sought to shame her into silence, she transformed their scorn into momentum. Crockett developed a unique resilience, the ability to absorb the blows of a system designed to diminish her and to respond with sharper arguments, fiercer advocacy, and an even greater fire. Her leap into politics was not about personal ambition, but about amplifying the voices she had long defended in court. Running for Congress meant stepping into a world where every move would be scrutinized, where attacks would come faster and fiercer. But Crockett was ready. She knew how to turn pressure into firepower. Her campaign was built on authenticity, on telling voters exactly what she believed, rather than pandering to what they wanted to hear. That honesty, raw and unapologetic, resonated. The attacks came quickly. Opponents painted her as too radical, too combative, too unpolished. But each attempt to diminish her backfired. When critics mocked her style, she doubled down, reminding voters that she was not there to play by outdated rules of decorum, but to fight for justice. When rivals tried to corner her in debates, she flipped their talking points back on them with a calm smile that cut deeper than any insult. Time and again, she proved that she could take the heat and turn it into light. What made her stand out was not just her sharp tongue or her legal acumen. It was her ability to embody dignity even when under attack. A political landscape filled with theatrics and shouting matches, Crockett mastered the art of restraint, showing that composure could be more devastating than fury. Viewers who watched her dismantle opponents saw not just a politician, but a woman carrying the weight of generations who had been told to sit down and be quiet, choosing instead to stand tall and speak louder for her supporters. She became more than a representative. She became a symbol, proof that someone who looked like them, who lived like them, could rise to the halls of power without abandoning their roots. For her detractors, she was an irritant they could not shake, a reminder that their old playbook of intimidation no longer worked on everyone. Every step of Crockett's journey had prepared her for confrontation with authority figures who tried to put her in her place. Every insult, every dismissal, every attempt to belittle her had only sharpened her steel. She had learned that when systems tried to box her in, she could not only break out, but expand the space for others behind her. And so, when Judge Beryl Howell slammed down her gavel and declared the intent to sanction her, Crockett did not tremble. She'd already faced down greater storms, endured harsher trials, and risen above deeper scars. She knew what this moment was. Another attempt to silence a voice that refused to be silenced. Her calm was not passivity. It was the stillness of someone who understood the weight of the moment. Someone who knew her life had been preparing her for this very battle. Crockett was not just defending herself. She was standing for everyone who had ever been told to shrink. And in that packed courtroom, all those years of struggle would crystallize in one unforgettable moment. The gavel struck again, sharper this time, as if Judge Howell could pound submission into existence. Her voice cut through the charged air, rising with each word. She invoked precedent, codes of conduct, the supposed sanctity of the courtroom. Every phrase was meant to remind Crockett and the audience that here, Howell was sovereign. "This chamber is not a stage for political grandstanding," she declared, her tone dripping with contempt. "It is a place of order, of discipline, and that discipline must be enforced." Crockett did not flinch. She sat steady, her gaze level, her hands folded as though she were listening to a lecture she had already anticipated. Her silence unsettled Howell, though the judge tried to mask it with more force. The louder Howell became, the more striking Crockett's composure appeared. Observers leaned forward, torn between fascination and disbelief. To hear a judge raise her voice like this was rare, almost taboo. But Howell pressed on, her words swelling with the cadence of someone desperate to reclaim control. "This court," she snapped, "will not tolerate behavior that undermines its authority. Representative Crockett must understand she is not above the law, nor is she immune to consequence." The words reverberated through the chamber, but it was Crockett's stillness that echoed louder. She tilted her head slightly, almost imperceptibly, as though weighing the accusations. But she offered nothing in return, not yet. That refusal to react became its own form of defiance. It was as if she were saying, "Without words, I will not play by the script you've written for me." Howell's frustration began to seep through the cracks. Her robe and gavel gave her the trappings of absolute authority, but Crockett's calm presence chipped away at the illusion. The contrast was palpable. One figure growing more animated, more desperate to assert dominance, while the other radiated the quiet strength of someone who had already survived greater storms. Whispers rustled through the gallery. Some spectators expected Crockett to snap back, to meet fire with fire. Others marveled at her restraint, realizing that the silence itself was more cutting than any rebuttal could have been. Reporters scribbled furiously, trying to capture the unfolding drama without missing the subtleties, the tremor in Howell's tone, the serenity in Crockett's stillness. It was not just a clash of words, it was a clash of styles, of values. Howell leaned on hierarchy, demanding obedience. Crockett leaned on dignity, refusing to be rattled. The dynamic became clearer with each passing second. One was fighting to hold power, the other was showing she could not be controlled. Howell's voice reached a near crescendo. If Representative Crockett refuses to acknowledge this court's authority, then this court has no choice but to impose the sanction. The words landed heavily, but again, Crockett offered only silence. She let the statement hang in the air, let it suffocate under its own weight. Every spectator could feel it. Something seismic was about to happen. The tension was unbearable, the kind that made hearts pound and breaths shorten. The outcome was not yet written, but the balance of power was already shifting. Howell had raised her voice to its highest pitch, yet somehow she seemed smaller, diminished by the very fury she unleashed. Crockett, in contrast, had spoken not a word, and yet, in that silence, she commanded the room. What came next would determine whether this moment was remembered as a rebuke or as a revolution. And in the stillness between gavel strikes, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the break in silence that would change everything. It stretched until it felt like the entire building might collapse under its weight. Judge Howell's last words, her threat of sanction, still rang in the air, brittle and sharp. Every spectator, every reporter, every aide in the gallery leaned forward, waiting for the Congresswoman to either explode or concede. The moment had swollen into something larger than courtroom procedure. It was history pressing down, demanding a response. And then Jasmine Crockett finally moved. She lifted her chin, the movement small but deliberate, as if signaling that the silence was over on her terms, not Howell's. Her voice, when it came, was not raised. It did not crack. It was calm, measured, each word polished with the clarity of someone who had rehearsed this battle long before it ever began. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she began, the phrase polite but carrying a razor edge, "sanctions are not tools for silencing inconvenient truths." The words sliced through the courtroom like a blade through glass. A few gasps escaped from the gallery. A journalist dropped his pen, scrambled to pick it up, then scribbled frantically too. "Capture the line." Lawyers exchanged quick, wide-eyed glances. For the first time, Howell's jaw tightened. Crockett leaned forward, her tone steady but laced with undeniable authority. "Precedent is clear. Sanctions are designed to curb abuse of the process, frivolous filings, bad faith tactics, deliberate obstruction. I have done none of these things. What I have done is exercise my duty, not as an attorney in your courtroom, but as an elected representative of the people." Her words carried weight beyond legal jargon. They were a reminder. She was not just another figure before the bench. She carried the mandate of voters, the voices of communities too often excluded from halls of power. Each sentence reframed the narrative, turning Howell's accusation into evidence of overreach. Reporters could barely keep up. The click of keyboards echoed like rain against the walls as Crockett's words flowed. On social media, early whispers from those inside the courtroom began to appear. "She's standing her ground. She's turning it back on Howell. This is unreal." Crockett paused briefly, letting the tension breathe before continuing. "What undermines the integrity of this process is not my presence, not my words. It is the misuse of judicial authority to silence a member of Congress for doing her job. That, Your Honor, is what erodes respect for the courts." The gallery erupted in whispers. Even seasoned attorneys, usually stoic in the face of drama, struggled to mask their astonishment. Howell shifted in her seat, tapping her gavel once, as though trying to reassert control, but the gesture only highlighted how little command she still had. Crockett pressed on, her cadence deliberate, each phrase building on the last. "If the sanctioning power is to mean anything, it must be applied with fairness. It cannot be weaponized to discipline truth-tellers, nor can it be reserved for those who dare to challenge power. That is not the law. That is politics dressed up in a robe." The shot landed squarely. Howell's eyes narrowed, her expression taut, but she did not interrupt. She couldn't, not without confirming every word Crockett had just spoken. Still, Crockett rose higher. "Your Honor, you may hold this gavel. You may sit in this seat of authority. But authority without legitimacy is nothing more than force. And force cannot outlast truth." The room froze. For a moment, even the clicking of cameras stopped, as if stunned into reverence. One could almost hear the collective intake of breath as Crockett's words thundered without volume. The clip began to spread. Tweets popped up. "This is the line. Watch this moment." Hashtags formed mid-hearing. Hashtag truth over force. Hashtag stand with Crockett. Commentators who usually avoided court procedure were suddenly weighing in. "She's rewriting the narrative in real time." Crockett wasn't finished. She shifted her gaze directly toward Howell, unflinching. "The law is meant to protect the powerless from the powerful, not the other way around. And if that principle is lost, then this chamber is not a court of justice, it is a theater of control. I refuse to let that be my legacy, or yours." Whispers turned into muffled applause before being hushed by security. The energy was electric, like a current sparking across the gallery. Crockett's words did not just defend her, they indicted the very misuse of authority she had been accused of undermining. Howell gripped her gavel tightly, her knuckles whitening, but she remained silent. Crockett, sensing the shift, pressed the advantage. Her tone softened, but her words carried more weight. I've been told all my life to lower my voice, to take up less space, to defer to those who claim authority over me. I have heard it from teachers, from critics, from political rivals. And yet every time I chose to stand firm, I discovered that dignity does not bow. Not to intimidation, not to arrogance, not to fear. A young law student in the back row covered her mouth, eyes wide with awe. An older journalist shook his head slowly, whispering to his colleague, This is one for the books. Crockett leaned back slightly, delivering her final blow with the precision of a surgeon. So if this court believes that sanctioning me will silence me, let it be known, silence is not an option. Not for me. Not for the people I represent. And not for anyone who still believes that justice means something in America. The words hung heavy, the air charged with something almost spiritual. And then came the line, the mic drop, the pivot from defense to triumph. She straightened her posture, her voice unyielding. If speaking truth is sanctionable, then let history record this day as the moment truth put the gavel on trial. The reaction was instantaneous. Gasps, murmurs, a stifled cheer, quickly hushed by an officer. Porter's fingers flew across keyboards. Social media erupted with clips, each replayed, dissected, and shared with captions like Crockett just owned the courtroom. This is what courage looks like. Momentarily frozen, struck her gavel once more, but it no longer carried the same force. Sound echoed hollowly, like a performance no one was buying. For the first time, she looked less like a sovereign and more like a spectator in a play she could not control. The gavel fell again. This time, it wasn't Howell. In control, the sound of the gavel had barely faded when the first clips hit the internet. A shaky phone recording from the gallery spread like wildfire, captioned with 3 explosive words, "She did that." Within minutes, hashtags ignited across Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. Hashtag truth on trial, hashtag stand with Crockett, hashtag justice speaks. The end of the hour, they were trending globally. Memes followed, fast and furious. One showed Judge Howell, gavel raised, with the caption, "Thought she had the final word." Beside it, Crockett's calm stare. Actually, no. Another meme depicted a courtroom split in two. On one side, Howell cloaked in shadows. On the other, Crockett bathed in light, with the words, "Force versus truth." Mainstream outlets couldn't resist. CNN ran a breaking chyron. Crockett defies sanction threat in stunning courtroom clash. MSNBC called it the mic drop heard round the legal world. Even outlets that usually dismissed her gave the moment oxygen, replaying the line over and over. If speaking truth is sanctionable, then let history record this day as the moment truth put the gavel on trial. On social media, validation poured in from every corner of American life. One activist tweeted, "As a black woman, I've felt that gavel on my spirit my whole life. Crockett spoke for all of us today." A teacher in Arizona posted a TikTok. Reaction, tears in her eyes. "My students are watching this clip in class right now. They're seeing what dignity looks like." A factory worker from Ohio wrote on Facebook, "I don't follow politics much, but this woman, she's the real deal." Commentators on cable news panels replayed the moment frame by frame. One analyst leaned in, practically whispering, "You could see it. The instant power shifted." Howell looked like the judge on paper, but Crockett was the authority. In that room, another commentator added, this wasn't just a defense. It was a masterclass in reclaiming voice, especially for those who've been told their whole lives to be silent. Meanwhile, Howell's camp retreated into silence. No press conference. No statement. Just a trickle of anonymous quotes to reporters. The judge was merely maintaining decorum, but no one was buying it. The images told the story. Howell's scowl against Crockett's composure, the gavel's hollow echo against the resonance of words that refused to die. In contrast, Crockett's stature seemed to grow by the minute. She became more than a congresswoman, more than a defendant in a hearing. She became a symbol. Late-night hosts turned her mic drop into a punchline, but even in humor, the reverence remained. Usually judges put people on trial, one joked. Tonight Howell got benched. Across campuses, students replayed the video, some staging mock trials with Crockett's words as their script. Activist groups turned her quote into posters and t-shirts, the line already immortalized. Truth put the gavel on trial. It became a rallying cry for anyone who had ever been silenced in a boardroom, a classroom, a workplace. And it wasn't just progressives who noticed. Independents, moderates, even some conservatives admitted the power of the moment. A right-leaning columnist wrote reluctantly, "I don't agree with her politics, but I respect the courage it takes to look power in the eye and not blink." The ripple effect deepened with each hour. Journalists who had written off Crockett as a freshman firebrand were suddenly revisiting her record. Activists saw in her a vessel for their frustrations. Everyday people saw in her a reflection of their own struggles against systems that seemed too vast to fight. By the next morning, every major outlet had dissected the clash. But one thing became clear. The sanction attempt itself, the supposed headline, had vanished into irrelevance. The news cycle wasn't about the ruling, it was about the moment. As one commentator put it on live television, this wasn't a courtroom drama. This was a cultural reset. People won't remember the legal technicalities. They'll remember the image of a young black congresswoman staring down power and refusing to shrink. And so the sanction, that heavy word Howell had hoped would crush Crockett, dissolved into background noise. It no longer mattered. The ruling was forgotten. The moment became legend. When the noise subsided and the headlines began to crystallize, Jasmine Crockett chose not to linger on herself. She stood before microphones, not as someone basking in personal victory, but as a messenger for something larger. Her voice was steady, the same calm that had shaken a courtroom now, carrying outward to the nation. "This isn't about me," she said, pausing long enough for every reporter to lean closer. "It's about silencing voices that challenge power. And if they can try it with me, they can try it with anyone." Those words reframed the entire saga. What might have been, cast as a skirmish between a judge and a congresswoman, suddenly became a mirror held up to the country. Howell had worn the robe of authority, but Crockett exposed the deeper struggle underneath, the endless effort of institutions to muffle dissenting voices, especially when those voices belong to women, to people of color, to anyone who dares disturb the old order. And in reframing the attack, Crockett offered a truth as old as democracy itself, that dignity and calm will always outlast arrogance and intimidation. "The robe may carry weight," she said softly, "but truth carries farther. You can strike a gavel, you can raise your voice, but nothing echoes longer than dignity." Her resilience became more than a personal triumph. It was a universal story. Ordinary people saw themselves in her composure. Workers standing up to unfair bosses, immigrants facing bureaucracy designed to break them, students demanding respect from institutions that dismissed them all could see in Crockett's silence, and her words the blueprint for defiance. She wasn't simply speaking for herself. She was speaking the language of endurance shared across communities who had been told to sit down, to be quiet, to accept less than justice. The lesson resonated. Pressure does not have to breed anger, and intimidation does not have to yield submission. Sometimes the most radical act is to remain composed, to let arrogance exhaust itself until it collapses under its own weight. Crockett embodied that lesson not in theory, but in real time. Under the searing lights of power, her words grew into an inspirational crescendo. That day in that courtroom, truth spoke and arrogance shattered. Not because I shouted louder, but because I refused to be diminished. That's what every one of us can carry into our own struggles. Dignity is not weakness. Calm is not. Surrender. Together, they are power. Applause rippled through the crowd, but Crockett's eyes stayed steady, not on the cameras, but on the people beyond them. She knew this was bigger than her story. It was about rewriting the script of who gets to speak, who gets to stand tall, and who gets remembered when the echoes fade. And as the cameras zoomed in, the moment solidified into something greater than a courtroom clash. It became a testament that even in the face of sanctioned silence, voices can rise. Even when draped in authority, arrogance can fall. And even when all the odds tilt toward power, truth still finds a way to break through. But the story didn't end inside those four walls. When the dust settled, Jasmine Crockett didn't seize the moment to boast. She didn't speak of personal vindication or parade the headlines already swirling across the nation. Instead, she shifted the lens outward, away from herself, toward the struggle her moment symbolized. Standing tall, her voice carried the same calm that had disarmed Judge Howell just hours before. "This isn't about me," she said with quiet force. "It's about silencing voices that challenge power. And if those voices fall silent here in this courtroom, they can fall silent anywhere." With that, Crockett transformed a confrontation into a parable. She reminded the nation that the gavel may silence one person for a moment, but it cannot crush the chorus of truth rising from every corner of society. By refusing to personalize the attack, she gave it meaning beyond her own. Battle. The hearing became a metaphor for every workplace where a woman of color is told she's too loud. Every classroom where an immigrant child is mocked for an accent. Every home where dignity is tested against an unjust system. Her message was universal. Dignity and calm always outlast arrogance and intimidation. "The louder they try to drown you out," she continued, "the clearer your truth becomes. The more they try to push you down, the stronger you rise. Arrogance always burns itself out. But dignity, it endures." That endurance was no abstraction. Crockett embodied it in that moment, and millions saw themselves reflected in her poise. The worker standing up to a boss who twists rules to break unions. The parent fighting for their child against a bureaucracy that shrugs at inequality. The student refusing to let silence erase their story. Each of them could see in Crockett's steadiness a mirror of their own resilience. What she showed was not just defiance, it was a different kind of power. Power to turn pressure into firepower, to let arrogance collapse under its own fury while meeting it with composure. She didn't just dismantle Howell's authority, she revealed a truth. Larger than the courtroom itself, that arrogance is loud but brittle, while dignity is quiet but unbreakable. Her words built into a crescendo, not shouted but spoken with a clarity that carried farther than any gavel strike could reach. In that courtroom, she declared, "Truth spoken, arrogance shattered. Not because I shouted louder, not because I fought dirtier, but because I refused to be diminished." That is what every one of us must remember. Our dignity is our weapon, and it cannot be taken unless we surrender it. The audience, both in the room and across the country, felt the weight of those words. They weren't just hearing a congresswoman recount her defense. They were hearing their own story elevated into history. Crockett wasn't simply surviving an attack. She was reframing it as proof that ordinary people can outlast entrenched systems if they cling to truth and dignity. The moment became more than politics. It became a moral lesson, a universal truth, one that parents could teach their children, that communities could carry into protests, that individuals could whisper to themselves when facing battles that seemed impossible. But even as the applause swelled, Crockett knew her words were not the end, they were a beginning. Her gaze swept the room, steady and unyielding. And with one final line, she set the stage for what was still to come. But the story didn't end inside those four walls. Judge Beryl Howell attempted to sanction Jasmine Crockett. Instead, Crockett left the courtroom standing taller than ever. What was meant to be a punishment became a platform. What was supposed to silence her became the very stage where truth spoke louder than arrogance. In that clash, the robe and the gavel lost their grip, while dignity rose untouchable. This is the lesson history has shown us again and again. Intimidation may win the moment, but it never wins the era. Arrogance may pound its fist, but it crumbles under the weight of truth, and dignity, steady, unshaken, always outlasts the storm. Crockett proved it in that courtroom, and her example now belongs to every person who has ever felt cornered, unheard, or underestimated. Because this story isn't only about one congresswoman and one judge. It's about us. It's about the power of refusing to bow down, the strength of holding calm in the face of fury, the fire that comes when ordinary people demand to be seen and heard. That is what keeps democracy alive, not gavel strikes. It's not shouted decrees, but the unshakable dignity of those who will not yield. So if this moment moved you, if you felt even a spark of that fire, don't let it end here. Subscribe to this channel, share this story, and carry its lesson into your own life. Join a community that refuses to shrink, that stands with leaders who dare to defy intimidation, and that believes dignity is not weakness, it is power. Stand with Jasmine Crockett. Stand with truth. Stand with dignity. The fight isn't over, and together we are writing the next chapter.